Hello, I'm Earl Wilson. Today we're going to continue our series by talking about a very important area, and that's the area of fantasy and the impact that fantasy has on your life and the impact that fantasy has on your compulsive sexual behavior. I call this age the age of fantasy because I see people dreaming dreams and spending their time being lost in video games, spending their time being lost in the social media, and in reality TV, which I think if you look at it could probably be called fantasy TV because people are trying to identify with people that they could be like, that maybe if they were like them, things would be better. And so we have this struggle of all the input, or a great deal of the input we get is encourage us to live out our lives through other people. And that going into that kind of fantasy can oftentimes cause you to lose a contact with the real. Since the onset of internet pornography, we've seen a great change in people's behavior with regard to sexual behavior. Patrick Carnes has called internet pornography the cocaine of sexual addiction. It's readily available and it's very powerful. I once in one day had two pastors come to me because they said to me, I've become instantly addicted to to internet pornography, sexual pornography on the internet. And as I talked with them, they indeed had resisted up to that point. When they started to get drawn into the fantasy, they became lost in the fantasy and kept it up and kept it up. And they fortunately were concerned enough, they immediately sought help, tried to get someone to help them to understand what was happening to them so they could get back on track with their lives. Now, I want to talk with you about problem areas that I see with regard to living in fantasy. One of them is that as you live in fantasy, your thinking begins to erode. You begin to entertain thoughts and ideas that before you might have said, oh, phooey, nothing to do with that. But as part of that thinking is, oh, what if I was like that? Or what if I did that? Or what if I was with her? Or what if? And you keep going on that. And then there's an erosion that says, well, I could. And that takes you even farther. Sometimes I could, she would. And so men then begin to leave fantasy, and their thinking allows them to make plans, which take them deeper into the fantasy cycle. Then the defensive side of the thinking is basically the side that justifies the use of fantasy and staying in fantasy. And that basically says it's not hurting anyone, or I can take it or leave it. I don't have to be here, or this is never going to impact my job, or this is never going to impact my family. So we set up defenses that support the fantasy. Now, in some cases, fantasy impacts families to the point that one person has become so involved in fantasy that the relationship with the spouse has changed. And he may even change to the point where he feels like he can't respond sexually to his spouse unless there's fantasy involved. I remember vividly a time when I was speaking at a church in Massachusetts to a group of about 150 men. And I said, we're going to talk about the problem of using fantasy to stimulate your sex life with your wife. And a man jumped up, clear in the back of the room. He started running down the aisle, and he said, I have to speak to that. And I didn't know what to do, quite frankly. I thought, is this guy really solid? And I said, okay, go ahead. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, it ruined not just my sex life, but it ruined my marriage. Because my wife and I stopped making love to each other other, and we become a performer on a stage. And you could have heard a pin drop in that audience, because many of the men were either contemplating or had contemplated the same thing, and were recognizing that taking fantasy into their bedrooms wasn't the answer, wasn't the cure. In fact, it may be the source of the problem. Now, entertaining fantasy will eventually lead to behavior change. Now, behavior change is not bad, but behavior change needs to be guarded so that you make sure it's good, that it's headed in the right direction. So oftentimes people view fantasy and then they think, I should be like that. Well, I have a better suggestion. I think they should be how God made them. I think they should be using the characteristics that God's given them and finding and developing the strengths that they have, because I believe this is the real source of happiness. But as behavior change takes place, it tends to erode also, and you tend to go deeper and deeper into the things that you've told yourself, I will never do that. One man told me, he said, I had made an agreement with myself that I'd never have an affair. And he said it lasted 5 years. And then all of a sudden I gave up. I quit fighting. Keeping my vow didn't make any difference to me. And I'm sure that's the same kind of erosion that I went through in my own life. Now, the behaviors that you develop during fantasy become habitual. And this is a huge problem because you automatically do certain things. If you want an example of this, the next time you pick up the remote control on your TV, see what you do with it. Many men immediately change channels. They change channels because they are looking for something. They don't know what it is. They're looking for something to stimulate fantasy. They're looking for something to stimulate sexual arousal. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about how to break that habit, but I think most of you recognize you have certain habits. You do certain things. And some people read the want ads because want ads in the paper, not because they're looking for a new tractor or a new lawnmower, but they're looking for some kind of sexual stimulation. And obviously, a lot of our advertising is involved with sexual stimulation. So these are some of the problem areas. Now we'll turn to some of the areas where we can begin to move away from fantasy. I've discovered 5 things that have helped me personally to move out of fantasy and to get back to where I believe it's healthier for me to be. First of all, I just had to call it like it is. I just had to recognize, all right, that's fantasy. That's not going to happen. Let's get real. Those kind of things. One of the interesting things that I learned from my clients about this. I had client after client who were coming in and complaining to me that they were being sexually tempted by a billboard that was put up along the interstate showing an almost naked lady. And so I said to them, what if we just call that what it is? And they looked at me kind of strangely, and I said, what is it? A little paper involved, a little cardboard, a few nails, some tape, something to hold it down. What if instead of going, wow, she's gorgeous, and taking that into some kind of fantasy, you said, oh, I guess I don't need to look at that pile of wood chip again, or I don't need that paper to entertain me. And it's interesting, just making a difference in the way they called it allowed some of them to be released from the hole that they put themselves into by allowing that one silly billboard to take them into fantasy and then farther back into the sometimes even to fail in reaching their sobriety goals. So first thing, call it like it is. This is just a fantasy. I'm not going to go there. That's one of the ways that I've said this. Or sometimes, if it's been important, I've said to my wife, I've been fantasizing about taking this trip with you. Can we make this happen? Or do you want to make it happen? And then we move on from there. But we need to call it like it is. Next, I want to talk about being honest about the hold that living in fantasy has upon you. My dad helped me make some steps in this direction. After I finally got up enough courage to tell him of all the stuff that I'd been involved in and the potential impact that it was going to have on me, he was walking with me one day, or I was walking with him, walking him to the restaurant for a little lunch, and we came back and he was kind of hobbling. He was an amputee by that time, walked with a cane, didn't have much lungs left, 80-some years old. And he caught me somehow. He looked right in my eye and he said, "Why do you go see that shrink anyway?" I was a little bit insulted because being a shrink myself, I thought, well, I wonder what he thinks about me. And I said, "I don't know, Dad. I guess I'm seeing him because I want to help in learning why I'm doing what I'm doing so I won't do it anymore." And he said, "I can tell you that." And I thought, sure, wise guy. He said, "You do it because you want to." And I thought, why do I want to? And I realized that the why I wanted to had a great deal to do with how deeply involved I was in fantasy and how much I had structured life ahead of me around fantasy, which, yes, it was what I wanted to do. It was my choice to do those things, but I'd really not given it the proper consideration. Is this what I really want to do? Therefore, I really didn't understand the hold it had on me. I really didn't understand how deeply I was involved in a double life that involved some reality and a whole lot of fantasy. It's really key to be honest where your behavior is leading you, because fantasy behaviors lead to places where we don't really think they're going. Fantasy behaviors lead to fantasy outcomes. We may say, "I'll live happily ever after," but fantasy rarely ends up living happily ever after. It was fine for Grimm, but I don't know how fine it is for today. Now, one of the things that helps you to do that is to make sure you complete the ledger. We immediately form a ledger that says, I can do this and this and this and this, and I'll be happy. But we don't do the other side of the ledger and say, and what impact will that have on the rest of my life? I mentioned before that I had to make some decisions about what I wanted. And I decided what I wanted was to be married to Sandy Wilson, to be a man of integrity, to have my relationship with God. There was none of those three was I going to reach by continuing in fantasy. So completing the ledger for me began close to the time I repented, when I really gave some serious thought to what was going on in my life. When you actually complete the ledger, as I said, this enables you to really make some new directions and to decide, okay, what do I want? Where am I going? And then at that point in time, changing your orientation to what is rather than what if. Because when people move to what if, they leave out most of the more important things in their life. The things that brought them together, the joy they have with certain relationships, like their children or their in-laws and certainly their wife. And so actually focusing on what is, and if you invest a portion of the time that you've invested in your chasing fantasies into building the what is in your life, it's absolutely amazing how that quality of life can change and move upward. And as your quality of life in what is begins to change, you'll find that the need for what if begins to diminish. And that's an exciting thing. That's a gift from the Lord. That's something he gives us as we refocus and begin to recognize that what is pretty valuable. I dealt with a man one time, and he was sitting in my office crying, and he said, "I can't believe how stupid I was." And he said, "You'd talked to me about fantasy, and it got me to thinking." He says, "I was fantasizing about a woman who was a bad woman." He said she was a bad woman, and I was fantasizing about her only because of my desire to do bad things with her. And he said, in the meantime, I was leaving behind one of the most perfect, beautiful women in the world. And he said, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I was making that terrible decision on the basis of breast size. And he said, I can't handle that. I need to get over that. So the shift back to what is can be a very exciting time in your life. And I think recognizing the good in all relationships, recognizing what you've lost in the time spent fleeing God instead of pursuing God. Just realizing in every aspect of your life what is has real potential and can take you somewhere. And even if your life is filled with problems, what is you get to actually move away from those problems. You get to solve those problems. You get to learn to trust God and see how he solves those problems for you and with you. So this is a key thing. Now, the other thing that I just question you on is decide to stick with it. When you get discouraged, don't say, oh, well, it's not going to work. Say, how can I make it work better? How can I spend more time living what is and less time living what if? How can I really pursue the fantasy which has been so destructive and get back to real life where there can be promise and hope in good times to come?